The village of Ashford, tucked deep within the English countryside, looked like a place where time had learned to move more slowly. Narrow lanes wound past hedgerows and stone cottages, the kind of roads where neighbors would wave as they passed, and shopkeepers always remembered your name. It was the kind of village that people in the cities often dreamed about when they thought of escape. A place where crime was little more than an occasional stolen bicycle or a drunken scuffle at the local pub. By the early 1990s, Ashford had barely changed in half a century. Families still gathered at the parish church on Sundays. The same bell that had tolled for generations still rang across the rooftops. On Saturday mornings, the air smelled of fresh bread drifting out of the only bakery in town. Children rode their bikes down to the stream without fear, sometimes not returning until evening, their parents unconcerned. Life was quiet, predictable, ordinary, but that sense of safety would be shattered. What happened one September night in 1994 would permanently scar the soul of Ashford, transforming it from a sleepy English village into the setting of one of the country's most haunting unsolved crimes. Before that night, though, Ashford was just home, especially for the Carter family. Emily Carter was born in the spring of 1980, on one of those typically wet English evenings when the sky seemed determined to wash the world clean. Her mother, Helen Carter, often joked that Emily had come into the world determined to make herself heard. Her first cries echoed through the small hospital ward, silencing the other babies for a brief moment. Helen was a single mother, a situation that in a small village often came with whispers. Emily's father had left before her birth, his identity a subject Helen never openly discussed. But Helen was determined that her daughter would never feel lacking. She worked long hours as a shop assistant, budgeting carefully to stretch her modest wages. Their small brick house at the edge of Ashford was simple, but filled with warmth, mismatched curtains, a second-hand sofa, and a kitchen table that always seemed too big for just the two of them. By the time Emily turned 4, their family grew. Helen gave birth to a son, Daniel, a quiet, wide-eyed boy with a mop of dark hair. Emily took to her role as older sister immediately. She hovered protectively over Daniel's cot, fetching nappies for Helen, and even trying to sing him to sleep in her wobbly child's voice. As the years passed, their bond only grew stronger. Emily was the kind of child who lit up a room. Teachers often described her as a chatterbox, always eager to share a story, always the first to volunteer to help. She had a quick wit for her age and an irrepressible sense of humor that made even the sternest of adults smile. She was also fiercely loyal, especially to her mother and brother. Helen often said Emily carried the heart of 2 parents in her single small body. Despite the challenges of raising 2 children on her own, Helen managed to create a home that felt safe. She instilled in her children values of kindness, hard work, and resilience. Emily took them all to heart. She was an average student academically, but what she lacked in grades, she made up for in determination and charm. The Carter family was not wealthy, but they didn't need to be. Their home, though modest, was always filled with laughter. On summer evenings, Emily and Daniel would play in the garden until the sun dipped behind the hedges, while Helen watched from the kitchen window, hands deep in soapy dishwater, humming to herself. Emily's friends adored her. She was the kind of girl who always invited others to join in, who noticed when someone felt left out, who shared her lunch when someone forgot theirs. She had dreams too, big ones. She spoke often of becoming a nurse one day, so I can help people like Mum helps me and Daniel. By the summer of 1994, Emily was 14 years old, on the cusp of her teenage years. She was excited, nervous, and full of plans for starting secondary school that autumn. She'd spent the last weeks of summer riding bikes with her friends, sharing secrets in the park, and scribbling ideas in a diary she kept hidden beneath her bed. She was growing into herself, balancing childhood innocence with the early glimmers of independence. No one in Ashford could have guessed that this bright, protective, full-of-life girl would become the heart of the village's darkest nightmare. She cycled with her best friend Sophie Lambert, exploring hidden lanes and climbing the willow trees by the stream. They talked for hours about everything: their teachers, their crushes, their dreams of leaving Ashford one day. Sometimes Sophie would sleep over at Emily's, and they would whisper late into the night until Helen tapped on the wall and told them to keep it down. But Emily wasn't only a child at play. She had responsibilities. With Helen working shifts, Emily often helped care for Daniel. At 14, she knew how to make simple dinners, fold laundry, and keep him entertained. Though she sometimes complained, deep down she relished her role as his protector. As August drew to a close, there was an air of anticipation. Emily had bought new notebooks and pens for school. She had begged her mother for a slightly more fashionable pair of shoes than Helen thought necessary. But Helen relented. It was a special time. On the last Friday before school was to begin, Emily carefully laid out her outfit for the first day. She was nervous, but excited. No one could have known that she would never wear it. It was a Saturday evening, the kind that seemed unremarkable at the time. The sky was heavy with late summer clouds, and the faint smell of rain lingered in the air. Helen worked a short shift that afternoon, then brought home fish and chips for Emily and Daniel. They ate together in the kitchen, the three of them sharing stories and laughter. By nightfall, Daniel was tucked into bed, his small chest rising and falling with the deep breaths of childhood sleep. Helen, exhausted, retreated to her room. She kissed Emily goodnight, reminding her not to stay up too late. Emily nodded, curling up on the couch with a blanket and a book. The television hummed quietly in the background. The Carter home stood at the edge of Ashford, bordered by hedges and fields. On quiet nights, the only sounds were the distant hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. It was the kind of place where people rarely locked their doors, where crime was considered something that happened somewhere else. But sometime between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., the unthinkable happened. A figure moved silently across the narrow lane and into the garden. The back window of the Carter home, old and loosely fitted, offered little resistance. A sharp crack as the glass gave way, and the intruder was inside. What happened next could only be reconstructed from evidence and speculation, because the only witnesses were either dead or left with fractured memories. The attacker moved first toward Helen's bedroom. She was struck violently with a heavy metal object, a blow that fractured her skull and left her bleeding. She collapsed, but somehow clung to life. Emily, startled by the noise, had little time to react. She was assaulted in the living room, then dragged outside into the garden where the violence continued. The serenity of the night was replaced by horror. By the time the attacker slipped back into the darkness, the Carter home had been transformed into a nightmare. Inside, Daniel slept on, untouched, unaware. Later, investigators would study the broken window and wonder how long the intruder had been watching the house. The Carter family lived on a quiet lane, with only one streetlight casting its dim glow at the corner. Anyone passing by would have seen that Helen's curtains were drawn and the lights were off, except for the faint flicker of the television in the sitting room. The intruder must have known the vulnerability of the home. No guard dogs, no father figure, just a mother and 2 children, alone at the edge of the village. The glass pane shattered with a dull crack, followed by the squeal of wood as the frame gave way. Helen stirred in her sleep, half conscious, but before she could sit up, a shadow loomed at her bedside. A heavy blow struck her head. The sound was sickening, a dull thud that seemed to echo in the stillness of the house. She collapsed back in the mattress, blood pooling beneath her hair. Emily, on the sofa, startled awake. At first, she thought Daniel had fallen out of bed or that her mother had tripped. She sat up, blinking into the dark. That was when she saw the figure, tall, broad, moving toward her. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the glint of metal raised high, then the force of it crashing down. She cried out, but the sound was muffled by another blow. The attacker dragged Emily through the back door into the garden. The damp grass pressed cold against her skin as the violence escalated. The moon hid behind clouds, leaving the garden in near darkness. The attacker worked quickly, efficiently, as if rage and control existed in the same breath. By the time the figure slipped away into the night, silence returned. The only sound was Daniel's soft breathing in the next room. He never stirred, never woke. His innocence, at least for that night, was preserved. At sunrise, the village of Ashford carried on as it always had. Birds sang from hedges, milk was delivered to doorsteps, and the church bell tolled the hour. To the neighbors, it was just another Sunday morning. But Emily's best friend, Sophie Lambert, knew something was wrong. The two girls had made plans the night before. Sophie was to cycle over so they could spend the day together before school began that Tuesday. She had tried phoning that morning, but the line rang and rang. No answer. By mid-morning, worry gnawed at her. She pedaled quickly along the lane to the Carter's house, her bike tires crunching over gravel. As she pulled up, she noticed the front curtains still drawn. The house looked unnervingly still. She knocked on the door. No response. She called out, "Emily? Helen?" Silence. Uneasy, Sophie walked around to the back garden, pushing her bike through the gate. At first, she didn't understand what she was seeing. The grass was flattened, dark patches staining the earth. Then, her eyes fell on Emily. Her friend's body lay motionless in the garden, her face pale and her hair matted. Sophie froze. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. It was as if the world had tilted sideways. Finally, a strangled cry escaped her throat, loud enough to draw the attention of a neighbor. Within minutes, the quiet lane erupted into chaos. Villagers rushing, telephones dialing for police, voices raised in disbelief. Officers arrived swiftly, securing the scene. Helen was found in her bedroom, alive but gravely wounded. She was rushed to hospital, leaving behind the image that would haunt Sophie forever. The stillness of her best friend on the morning grass, the village's innocence broken beyond repair. Helen Carter's world faded in and out like fragments of a broken dream. When the paramedics carried her out of the house, she was barely conscious, her blood-soaked hair plastered to her face. The journey to the hospital was a blur of sirens and flashing lights. Every time her body tried to give in, a hand pressed against her chest, a voice urging her to stay with them. She was rushed into surgery at St. Thomas's Hospital in the nearest city. The blows to her head had fractured her skull in several places. Surgeons worked for hours, inserting metal plates into her cheekbone and skull. One of her eyes had been damaged beyond repair. She would survive, but the cost was heavy. Partial blindness, permanent dizziness, constant ringing in her ears. When Helen finally woke days later, her throat raw from the oxygen tube, she did not remember what had happened. Nurses leaned over her, their faces blurring in and out. She whispered one word, again and again, her voice hoarse. "Emily, Emily." But Emily was gone. It would take doctors weeks to tell her the truth in a way she could bear. For 3 long weeks, Helen remained in the hospital under tight security, guarded by officers who feared the attacker might return. She drifted between pain and confusion, her mind clawing for memories that would not come. What she didn't know was this: her family had been torn apart in one night, and the nightmare wasn't over. Somewhere, the person who had destroyed her home was still free. Ashford had always been the kind of place where children played cricket in the streets until dusk, where people left doors open on summer nights to let in the cool breeze. But after the night of September 3rd, everything changed. News of Emily Carter's murder spread like wildfire. By midday, every corner of the village knew. The church bell tolled, not for Sunday service, but to call the community together. People stood in clusters on the high street, speaking in hushed tones, eyes darting nervously as if the killer might be walking among them. Parents forbade their children from going out alone. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual. Locks that had rusted from years of disuse were suddenly polished and secured. Men who had never owned weapons before now kept hammers or heavy tools by their bedsides. The innocence of Ashford had been stripped away overnight. At school, Emily's classmates were stunned into silence. Teachers, unsure how to comfort them, spoke softly about grief and fear, but the words felt inadequate. Sophie Lambert did not return to school for days. She was haunted by what she had seen. The image of Emily lying in the garden etched permanently into her young mind. Even the adults, who had lived through decades of change and hardship, admitted they had never felt such fear. Whispers circulated in the pub. Who would do such a thing? Was it someone local? Was the murderer still among them? For the first time in living memory, Ashford was not safe. The shadows seemed longer. The night carried with it a weight that no one could shake. And somewhere, hidden within that fear, the attacker moved unnoticed, silent, watching, waiting. Detectives from the county constabulary arrived at the Carter home by mid-morning. The sight that greeted them was unlike anything they had encountered in years. The small, tidy brick house at the edge of Ashford was now a war zone. Shattered glass, bloodstains, overturned furniture. The back garden, once a place where Emily and Daniel had played, was now a graveyard of evidence. Crime scene investigators carefully documented every detail. They dusted for fingerprints, scraped soil samples, and measured the footprint left near the garden gate. It was a man's shoe, size 9 or 10, leather, worn at the heel. Whoever the intruder was, he had fled quickly, leaving almost nothing behind. No weapon was ever found. The case consumed the village. Detectives canvassed the streets, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had heard or seen something unusual that night. Most had slept through the attack. A few reported hearing a dog bark or noticing a shadow move across the lane, but nothing concrete. Helen, recovering in hospital, was interviewed repeatedly, but her memory was shattered. Each time she tried to remember, pain seared through her head, and the details slipped away like smoke. The one person who might have seen the intruder's face was trapped inside a fog of trauma. The police built theories. The killer had chosen the Carter family deliberately. He knew the home, knew that there was no father present, knew where the bedrooms were. This was no random act. It was personal, but personal crimes usually leave trails: jealous lovers, bitter ex-partners, resentful neighbors. Yet in Ashford, no such trail existed. Or if it did, it was buried deep beneath the quiet lives people tried so hard to protect. Weeks turned into months. Leads fizzled out, and then a name surfaced, a young man already suspected in another brutal case. Christopher Dean was 22 years old, living in a town just 13 kilometers from Ashford. He had grown up in a troubled household, drifting between relatives after his parents' marriage collapsed. Teachers remembered him as a boy with a quick temper and a tendency to lash out. By the time he reached adulthood, Christopher had already earned a reputation as a drifter, someone always skirting the edges of the law. 4 months after Emily Carter's murder, Christopher was arrested for the killing of Claire Reynolds, a 17-year-old girl attacked while walking home from party. The similarities were chilling: the brutality, the suddenness, the proximity to Ashford. Detectives immediately questioned whether Christopher had also been responsible for Emily's death. He had no solid alibi for the night of September 3rd. Witnesses placed him in the area in the weeks before the murder. And yet, when interrogated, Christopher denied everything. "I don't know anything about that girl," he told detectives, his voice flat, his eyes unblinking. Despite their suspicions, the police had no physical evidence tying him to Emily's case. The footprint didn't match his shoes. No fibers, no fingerprints, no blood. Forensic science in 1994 was limited. DNA testing existed, but was not yet as precise or accessible as it would later become. In Claire's case, Christopher eventually confessed to manslaughter and served 6 years in prison. But in Emily's case, he walked free. The file remained open, but without proof, there was nothing investigators could do. For the Carter family and the people of Ashford, the name Christopher Dean lingered like a ghost. Was he the one who had shattered their world? Or had the real killer slipped quietly back into the night, leaving everyone chasing shadows? As months turned into years, the Carter case slipped from headlines, but never from Ashford's collective memory. The small brick house at the edge of the village remained, but it was no longer just a home. It was a scar. People walking past would lower their voices, casting quick glances at the garden where Emily had died. Helen Carter returned home eventually, her body weaker, her face marked by scars that told the story of that night. She tried to rebuild a life for Daniel, who was still young enough to be shielded from the full horror. But every corner of the house whispered reminders. The broken window had been replaced, the walls repainted, Yet the atmosphere carried something heavier than paint could cover. The police never closed the case. Detectives changed over the years, new faces taking the file, each promising to uncover something missed before. But with no new evidence, their work often felt like circling a maze without an exit. Every anniversary of Emily's death brought renewed pain. Flowers appeared at the garden gate. Journalists visited Helen, asking the same questions. Do you remember anything more? Do you think the case will ever be solved? Helen tried everything. She submitted to hypnosis, to experimental treatments that attempted to trigger memory. She even agreed to sodium pentothal, the so-called truth serum, hoping it would unlock the images buried deep within her. Nothing worked. The crucial minutes of that night remained lost, erased by trauma and the brutality of the blows she had suffered. Meanwhile, Ashford adjusted to its new reality. Locks were now second nature. Children were no longer allowed to roam freely. At night, people checked the shadows more carefully. The village's innocence had been replaced by vigilance, and Emily's unsolved murder was the reason. In the late 1990s, detectives brought in a criminal profiler, a man named Dr. James Rowe, who had studied over 800 violent deaths. He was asked to look at Emily's case with fresh eyes, not through evidence alone, but through the lens of psychology. Dr. Rowe examined the crime scene photographs. The small house, neat and compact, no basement, just one sitting room and a single hallway. To him, it spoke of intimacy. This wasn't random, he told the officers. This was personal. He theorized that the attacker knew the family, not necessarily as a close friend, but as someone familiar enough to know their vulnerabilities. A single mother, a teenage daughter, an isolated home. The violence, he said, was off the charts. It wasn't simply about killing. It was about rage, years of pent-up anger unleashed in one horrific night. Perhaps the intruder had been rejected by Helen. Perhaps he had felt humiliated earlier that day. Whatever the trigger, it had exploded into something far greater than the situation itself. Dr. Rowe painted a picture of the killer. A local man, not an outsider. He knew too much about the Carters' routines. Not well-liked, someone women instinctively distrusted. Financially limited, which explained why he may have cleaned his clothes instead of discarding them, and kept moving through the community instead of fleeing. Emotionally detached, showing no remorse for Emily's death or for Helen's survival. The danger, Dr. Rowe warned, is that this man may still be here. He may be living among you, blending into the ordinary, carrying the secret of what he's done. Men like this don't always disappear. Sometimes they linger. Sometimes they even enjoy the fear they've created. His words chilled not only the detectives, but the entire village when fragments of his profile reached the public. For many, it meant that the nightmare wasn't in the past at all. It was still alive, walking the same streets, hidden behind a familiar face. In the early 2000s, a new theory emerged. A retired police officer, Barry Rule, published a book that connected Emily's death to a man he had encountered decades earlier, a traveling salesman named Lawrence Larry Talbot. Larry had drifted across the Midlands and the South, selling cheap household goods from the boot of his car. Behind the charm of his sales patter, however, lay a darker side. He had been caught trespassing, had a history of assault, and once carried what police called a rape kit in his vehicle: rope, knives, and gloves. Barry recalled an incident from 1971 when Larry had broken into his fiancée's home. The method of entry, a rear window, was chillingly similar to the Carter case. Though Barry had frightened him off that night, the memory lingered. When Emily was murdered years later, Barry felt the same shadow pass over him. The theory gained traction briefly, especially when villagers whispered that Larry had once passed through Ashford. But he was never charged, and by the time suspicion fell seriously upon him, he was dead. Whatever secrets he held were buried with him. For Helen, the years were measured not by birthdays or holidays, but by anniversaries. Each September brought back the weight of memory, not of what she saw, but of what she couldn't. She often told reporters that the cruelest part was knowing she had the answer locked inside her damaged mind. "If only I could remember," she would say, tears running down her face. "I saw him. I know I did. But it's gone." She tried everything science could offer: brain stimulation, magnetic therapy, even controversial treatments that promised to recover lost memory. Each time, hope swelled, and each time, she was left in despair. The moments before the blow, the glimpse of the intruder's face, were gone forever, like a computer shut down before saving. Daniel grew older, carrying the burden of being the boy who slept through the murder. At school, whispers followed him. He avoided the subject, but at home he sometimes asked his mother about that night. Helen could only shake her head, trapped in silence as much as her son. As the decades passed, Emily Carter became more than a memory. She became a symbol in Ashford of innocence lost, of justice delayed. Each year, villagers placed flowers at the garden gate. The local paper ran articles marking the anniversary, keeping her face alive in photographs. Paul Peton, a lifelong resident, once said, "We all lost something that night, even those of us who didn't know her personally. Our freedom, our safety, our peace of mind." Emily's death didn't just take her, it changed all of us. Children who grew up in the shadow of her story became parents themselves, passing down warnings their own parents had never needed to give. Lock the doors. Don't walk alone. Stay where I can see you. Emily's ghost lingered not in apparition, but in the habits of caution etched into a once carefree village. By 2020, the case was in the hands of a new detective. Forensic science had advanced, and every few years the evidence was re-examined, retested, compared against national databases. Yet the results were always the same: inconclusive. More than 30 years had passed. Helen was older, frailer, her vision dim, her body weakened. But her determination remained fierce. She still pleaded with the public. "Someone knows. Please, don't let my daughter be forgotten." A £50,000 reward was offered for information, but no one came forward. Perhaps the killer was dead. Perhaps he was still alive, living quietly, carrying his secret into old age. For the people of Ashford, the mystery remains like a wound that will not heal. Emily Carter, just 14, vibrant and full of promise, was taken in one night of unthinkable violence. Her story continues to echo through the village, through the lives of those left behind, and through the silence of a case still unsolved. Innocence is fragile. It can be shattered in a single night, leaving behind a darkness that lingers for decades. The tragedy of Emily Carter is not just a crime story. It is a reminder that justice, though delayed, must always be pursued, and that memory is the only weapon we have against forgetting.